My name is Jim, and I watch The Atheist Edge.
My name is Dr. Brady Blevins, and I watch The Atheist Edge.
Okay, I'm Chris here with Rex and Owen and Dan. We're continuing to talk about the Book of Job today, and we've talked a lot about the setup for the Book of Job and the history of it and where it kind of fits in. But there's a lot of interesting stuff going on at the end of Job too, where Job and his friends have had all this discussion about what God's doing, but then God himself finally speaks. And it's interesting when God comes in, and guys, I'll let you kind of go back and forth on this as you want. You know, he finally has heard Job talking all this time and lamenting his suffering, remaining faithful to all this. And he comes in and basically for several chapters he talks about his own credentials. He basically says to Job, who are you? Who were you? Did you create the world? Did you set all this up? Have you created all these wonderful creatures? And he goes on and on and on for this. And from the atheist perspective, it almost seems like he's avoiding the question. And so it's interesting, Dan, if I'm sure you're well versed, you've read this. How do you think that God's response to Job is a fair response? Do you think it's a good example of how we should be deferential to God, or what are your thoughts?
Well, avoiding what question? Just to be clear, when you say he's avoiding the question.
Well, it's the whole book, though. It's about the reasons for suffering. It's Job has had all these horrible things happen to him. By all appearances, God has allowed Satan to run rampant in his life, and kind of like analogous to our lives, we have all these things happen, and whether you want to blame God for them or not is irrelevant in terms of like natural evils like sickness or natural disasters, or the evil perpetuated by human beings. And there's no life that escapes suffering, and Job is supposed to be the prototypical example of how to respond to it. And so are we to just humble ourselves before God's power and take it? Or do you think that we as human beings have a grievance against God, the creator of the universe, who is supposed to be in control of all things?
Well, I think in terms of what you had brought up, the avoidance issue, that when you get into the, I think I've already said this, but the discourse of God in Job is the longest uninterrupted discourse of Yahweh speaking in Scripture to that point, in New Testament or Old Testament. And he doesn't mention what we see in the front end of the book. Job doesn't get any inclination of, hey, look, Job, I told Hasatan you were righteous. I said you were blameless. I said you were upright. He came to me. Blah, blah, blah. God doesn't even acknowledge Hasatan, the Satan, in his discourse to Job. So in the front end, just really interesting to get us there. There's as we were talking about earlier, we all agreed upon the eloquence of Job. If nothing else, you just read it as a literary work. It's a masterpiece. It would go up there with Homer and anything from the antiquity. It's a beautiful work of art if you want to just look at it that way. But what's interesting is that the author is a literary genius as well. He's like a Milton. He knows how to stack words. He knows double entendre. He has 5 words for darkness, several words for gold, 6 different words for trap. It's some of the hardest Hebrew in the Bible to translate. There are multivariant definitions of words in Job. But the author does a brilliant job in the first 2 chapters of setting us up for a total surprise. So if you've never read Job before, you get the picture. In chapter 1, Job is a righteous man. And in fact, it says that perhaps my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And so Job offered sacrifices on the possibility that his sons have cursed God. Isn't that interesting? So there's the first setup. Job is acting righteously, interceding for his children. Then we have Satan come to God. And Satan wants to tempt Job to curse God. So there's another setup, right? And then all the fury of the devil is unleashed upon Job. And what does Job's wife say? Curse God and die. And that seems to be the sort of the modern angst of this world, right? We want to do that. We just want to curse God and die and get it over with. We all have that shared. I think, me personally, I've lived the life of Job in different ways, and I understand the impulse to go, I get it. And Job is a righteous man who is, his wife obviously would have been a righteous woman, but she falls prey to tempting her husband to do that. So we have Job interceding for his children on the case that they may have cursed God. We have Satan wanting Job to curse God. We have Job's wife tempting him to curse God. And then when you go into chapter 3, who is the one who actually curses Job? Now, he doesn't curse God, but the historical context of what Job is saying is what we would consider magic. It is a real ancient Near Eastern curse. Job is calling upon the sorcerers who can rouse Leviathan to go back into the calendar, to take Job's birthday off the calendar. And not only that, Job curses the light that appeared in the sky on his birthday. He curses the light of the stars. He says, it's an exact antithetical curse against Genesis, where in Genesis we read, God said, let there be light. Job literally says, let there be darkness. So he's walking a very fine line and coming close to cursing God. He curses what God has made. He curses himself, wanting himself to go back to non-existence. And he curses God's stars. So Job is, I wish my birthday was cursed. Let it be dark, let it be black, let it be terrible, let it be awful. And curse the stars. Please curse the stars of my birthday. So when you get into Job, God's response to Job in 38, what you have is God speaking to Job in relation to the creation of the heavens and the earth. Because Job is trying to literally trying to unravel his own Genesis. He's going back and cursing what God said. God said, let there be light, I want darkness. Let there be life, let there be man, I want to not exist, right? And who can't at some point fathom, it would be better if I wasn't born, right? This is the curse in It's a Wonderful Life. I wish I was never born, right? That he gets his wish. And then you go through, the small town, what's the name of the town? Bedford Falls. The old savings and loan bill turns into Pottersville in his nightmare. His wife doesn't recognize him and, all this stuff. He gets his wish. It's kind of a Jobian kind of thing. Job doesn't get his wish. Instead, God comes to him and says, gird your loins, like Stanley Tucci in Devil Wears Prada. Miranda Priestley's coming into the office an hour early, and she's, what? She's supposed to be here an hour ago. And she leans out the window and tells everybody to gird their loins. Well, what was that? Dress yourself like a man, prepare yourself, tie yourself up, be ready for defending yourself, be ready for battle. And the first thing that God replies to Job in 38 is, where were you, as you said earlier, when I created the heavens and the earth? And earlier I was just telling Owen about God directly asks Job about constellations and stars. Can you guide them? Can you lead them? Do you know their ordinances? Can you loose the cords of Orion? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades? And so God is reminding Job, it's if you want to, the last 2 chapters in Job are an extended commentary on Genesis. And what it does for the problem of evil, Chris, I think, is that by not addressing Satan, God is reminding the audience that evil is not what you think it is. In fact, I think he's addressing the claim that oftentimes when we talk about the problem of evil, we set up evil like it's something antithetical to goodness, but with an equal and opposite force. And what God is saying, no, evil is not even that. It's emotionally difficult to endure. There's no question. It doesn't deny the existence of evil, but what it does is it puts evil in its proper context. It's not even nothing. And we are the ones that exacerbate the difficulties that come out of it, making it seem as though it's just as powerful, if not more powerful, than goodness.
But this is not to say, of course, that obviously you can make your suffering worse by
Sure.
how you respond to it.
Sure,
That's an entirely different question from the existence of the suffering itself.
Sure.
And I guess, Rex, Owen, do you guys feel like this is an adequate response to the question that atheists
So
always bring up about suffering?
Yeah, I would look at this, and I understand the view that you take and the approach that you're taking. I would look at this, and I would just ask a very simple question. I'm told that God is love. I'm told that for God so loved the world, He gave His only begotten Son. I'm told that Jesus was the Prince of Peace, and so I look.
But He has bad days too.
Right. If I have a sense of the Trinity, and I accept the Orthodox view that the three manifestations of the Godhead really are all different manifestations of the same Yahweh, and that we are talking, in fact, about the same Yahweh here, I would assert that this Yahweh is utterly unrecognizable from Jesus. In this book, to prove a point, the God of the universe, capital G, God of the universe, deliberately wiped out this man's family and punished him, and did it in a way that was designed to humiliate him, and then went through a multi-chapter discourse with him,
bragging about how great he is.
Right, bragging about how great he is. This is not. If I go to Corinthians and I do the test of love is faithful, love is kind, and then I look at this and I ask, love does not boast, right? Is that what we see in the last handful of chapters of Job? I do not see the New Testament understanding of a loving God manifested in this morality tale, and so this is a constant theme between you and me.
Well, in putting this back in,
this looks like a completely man-made document that represents thoroughly. I don't mean to cut you off. That thoroughly represents the values of the Bronze Age nomads who wrote it.
And the science as well, because I mean,
right.
as he's going through, everything he says about biology and astronomy and geology is in a very Bronze Age and earlier view of things. That's not at all the way the stars work.
Sure.
That's not at all the way life works and has developed on this planet. And so this is all pre-scientific. You would expect that God would at least bring some knowledge in addition to what man had at the time, and he doesn't here. He basically echoes what man thought about all of these things at the time in a braggadocious way.
Yeah.
And admittedly, let's be fair. This is he's using very flowery prose here.
Sure.
This may not be written as a scientific document.
So that's true, but literally, the quotes here, to Dan's point earlier, this is the longest discourse made by Yahweh anywhere in the Bible. It is right here.
And he reveals nothing that people didn't already know.
This is God actually talking out loud, presumably it's out loud, speaking to Job. If this is something other than a metaphor, and we talked about that earlier, if this is something other than a metaphor, then this is the God of the universe saying these things. So it doesn't have to be a scientific discourse. God is either gonna speak correctly about the natural world, or he's not.
Well, a couple things.
In fairness to Rex's point.
In light of what you said, which I think is an excellent point, that oftentimes is a point of difficulty for a lot of people that sort of struggle with thinking through the issue of New Testament, 1 Corinthians, love is patient, love is kind, and then Old Testament, what it seems like God's complete injustice. Now, to your point, and Job would actually probably echo, his relationship with God. He reminisces about when God was good to him, and cannot fathom what he did. In fact, he maintains his innocence throughout the entire book. So he is at the point of just excruciating pain. And like one commentator I read said that the difficulty, the double entendre of Job's suffering, the crucible in which he finds himself, is he's pleading to the God who is testing him to rescue him he's pleading for the God he used to know against the God who seems to have been punishing him. And so in like Job 16, and Job 19, he's crying out for an audience with God. Please tell me what this is. And Job's three friends are not helping, because you guys know what they all think about the situation. They all think Job did something.
Sure.
Right? So I think it's another helpful book for trying to look at somebody's situation and say, well, you need to repent, without understanding the context of what's going on, because Job, there's no need of Job there's nothing that Job did to exacerbate this. So to Owen, your point about New Testament love and Old Testament Job God, You guys know who the city of St. Louis was named after?
I'm gonna guess it's
St. Louis.
No, what king? What French king?
One of the Louis.
Yeah, the ninth,
Ninth,
13th
okay.
century.
Okay.
There is a story in a book that I read called The Middle Ages by Morris Bishop, who was a medieval scholar. And he, I didn't go beyond his text, but I'm assuming his story is credible historically. Louis was supposed to be, is believed to be, he was called St. Louis because he was a Mother Teresa of a monarch. Very benevolent and generous and capacious. And so he's walking along a medieval street in France in the 13th century, and it's early morning, and he's going down a street, and from a second or third story apartment window, a chamber pot is dumped on the king. And he found out the window, went up into the building, and found that that a student had risen early to do studies at the nearby school or university or wherever he was. And the student was absolutely horrified, and St. Louis gave him, instead of send him to the guillotine or whatever for soiling the regent's robes, he gave him a scholarship. And I think in some regard that is a portrait of how the God of Job is the God of Calvary, in that we dump our chamber pot. We absolutely pour out our worst on him. And he comes up into us and comes to us and gives us the kingdom. Because he takes upon himself. In other words, what I'm saying, Rex, to make the connection between Old Testament and the New, is that God puts himself in the place of Job.
So that's an interesting observation. There was an entirely different way in the first century or two. There was an entirely different way of understanding when we read the Old Testament and we read the nature of the Yahweh of the Old Testament, of Leviticus and of Job. And the Marcionite heresy is a fantastic example. I obviously it was not going to survive, right? But this was the idea that there was an Old Testament God that was distinct from the Father of Jesus, and that
according to Marcion.
According to Marcion, right?
Yeah. And he made his own canon. That's where we get the first
the
list of the books of the Bible.
The very first list.
Excluding the Old Testament entirely.
Right. Exactly.
And
I don't want to talk about that. Yeah, right. I
Right.
do, but Marcion didn't want to talk about
yeah,
it.
Marcion. Yeah.
Oh, he wanted to talk about it. He
Well,
can tell you
yeah,
exactly why he wasn't including it.
So there are examples in early Christianity where we have early church fathers who are leaving documents to us that are extant.
Sure.
And so there were different ways to address the problem. And so it's not a unique 21st century observation.
So how do you harmonize the God of the Old Testament?
That the God of
with
the
New
Old Testament is really everything Richard Dawkins said he was in the God Delusion. Vindictive, spiteful, bully, filicidal, whatever. There is an extraordinary degree of thuggishness and no offense, but what looks like prideful gangbanger behavior that you see on the part of the Yahweh of the Old Testament. And then we are asked to set all of that aside and to consider that Jesus is a completely different iteration, and then Paul teaches us later, and I'm not entirely convinced this is what Jesus intended, but Paul comes later and changes the message to say we're setting aside the old law altogether, that we weren't really clear of what parts we're setting aside, and that now what wound up becoming orthodoxy some hundreds of years later was that there was in fact a substitution of new law for old, that Jesus was the perfect human sacrifice, etc. But none of that gets us around the problem of the behavior of Yahweh. The same Yahweh here who permitted Satan to do all of these things to Job, and who was responsible for the Noachian flood and many of the other sort of really brutal things that we see in the Old Testament, is this, if we accept the doctrine of the Trinity, is exactly the same deity that is manifested in Jesus when he's walking around on the earth. There is clearly a dichotomy there that I've never really clearly seen a Christian address.
I
I'd love
I
for
don't
you
mean
to,
to
I'd
think
love
that
for you
I've
to take a
solved the
stab at that.
problem, but
I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I have an argument. What I shared with you with King Lewis was
Sure.
part of a future book that I'm developing is giving instances where Christ, of course, Christ was incarnate, and at the end of Matthew, he's talking about the sheep and the goats, and the sheep did this to me, and the goats didn't do this to me, and both of them are asking, then when did we or when did we not do these things? We certainly didn't see you, or when I was giving bread to that guy, I didn't know that was you, or when I didn't give bread to that guy, I didn't know that was you. If I knew that was you, I'd give you bread, right? So there's this multivariant idea of God's presence, Christ specifically, that manifests itself through human beings. So as the ancient doctrine, the orthodoxy says that man is created in God's image. We bear his image. What that imago Dei is it our intellects? Is it our sentience? Is it our physicality? There are many commentaries about what the imago Dei is and what that could be. So one of the things you guys remember, I don't know if you remember the Kobe satellite in April of 1992.
Sure.
The data from the Kobe satellite, what did it find? Do you know?
So that was the microwave background, right?
Well, we already knew the microwave background
Sure, we
radius
knew it was
existed.
there, but this
what they
was
were
the-
looking for were the seedlings. They wanted to look for the temperature density variations that would allow for the inevitable development of stars and ultimately galaxies. In other words, for there to be galaxies and stars, gravitational forces and light had to condense in pockets so that stars could form and then galaxies could form. So George Smoot and Team Company launched this satellite after many balloons and everything, and the data came back, the conclusions came back. They found the necessary seedlings. And George Smoot said, it's like looking at the face of God. Now, Smoot is not a theist, I don't think. Most physicists that I know that I've read on the popular level are not theists. But a philosopher of science by the name of Paul Feyerabend, do either of you know? He wrote a book called The Tyranny of Science. I don't think he was a theist either. I think he was a philosopher of science. I'm not sure exactly. He passed away. He gave I think it was a Templeton lecture in 1992. Or 93, and he uses the Kobe finding as an example, and he juxtaposes that with the terrible verdict, the injustice of what happened in Los Angeles in 1992, that same week. What was that?
So Rodney King.
The riots. Yeah.
It wasn't the actual beating of Mr. King. It was the verdict of not guilty of 4 of the police officers that were on the KTLA tape that was sent to a video tape was sent to the KTLA station. So the verdict was reached, not guilty. Well, the whole city erupted in a riot. LA had a riot in the 1960s. I was living in the heart of Hollywood when stuff went batty. I wasn't a Christian then, and I was kind of scared. Now, it wasn't what led me to Christ, but it was a mess. Reginald Denny, I don't know if you remember.
I do.
The guy that got, my house was like a block from there.
You're kidding.
No, I wish I was. It was hell on earth. I thought I was going to die. Mayor Bradley at the time imposed a curfew. Everybody had to be off the streets at 5 o'clock, and that's when I moved. That's when I was packing my car, and I went up north and found an apartment at Thousand Oaks. The point of this is that Paul Feyerabend, who he's not a theist, puts these two together and says, folks, what do we do with this? We got this fantastic scientific finding of the most ancient light that we know of, and we found this is like looking at the face of God, and then we have the LA riots. How do we do that? And I think, Owen, that's part and parcel of the difficulty that you're having with the reconciliation of what seems to be arbitrary.
Seems to be irreconcilable.
It seems to be irreconcilable. How can we celebrate this and have this? How can we have champagne for the Kobe and then 4 police officers get off scot-free in 1992? At least the verdict was not guilty. So I would say that this is Dan. This is not what Paul Feyerabend says. He goes into a philosophical discourse and tries to connect the two. He asks the question. He says, let me see if I have the quote here. Yes, he says, my fairy tale, that's how he posits it, starts with a question. Was there ever a connection between the majestic events in the heavens and the sad and often silly events on the earth? That's Paul Feyerabend asking this question. And now he goes into a philosophical treatise on this. I would say, yes. the question is that the one who said, "Let there be light," became incarnately Rodney King. Now, I'm not saying Jesus was Rodney King, but I'm saying that when the God of the universe stepped into our world, that's how we treated him.
So, I don't have any problem reconciling these things, because I think that if we are alone in the universe, or without any supernatural superintendent, this is exactly what the world would look like. You know, we are a very young species as these things go. We evolved from less intelligent species. At our best, we're capable of scientific understanding and advancement and progress in ethics, and at our worst, we're tribal and violent, and every day we see both of those things, and I don't need any supernatural explanation for that at all. I need us to continue to evolve.
Would you say, but you said this world is exactly what it would look like without
I think it's
God?
exactly what it would look like if there were no God, if these were just made up stories.
But that goes back to our earlier discussion about what would a divine universe look like.
Well, I don't know, because I don't believe in one, but you describe a divine universe, and it sounds just like the universe I live in that isn't divine. You know, I think that at a minimum, if the divine universe included a creator God or a superintendent God or multiple gods that had any interest in us knowing that they exist, they could absolutely convince us. I believe that an all-powerful God could convince me that he exists. And it doesn't appear he's even trying. And a text from, you know, many thousands of years ago, most of whom the authors are completely unknown, that is not compelling evidence.
When I was in college, one of my roommates and I were arguing, and he said, "What would it take to convince you to be a believer?" And I was relatively recent atheist at the time, and I said, "If the faith of a mustard seed can move a mountain, imitate my watch." You know, and I set my watch down, and I asked, just an example of something where when we know that the laws will behave in a certain way, we have every expectation that this is exactly how they're going to behave. We even have formulas like what's on your shirt. This is with great detail how the natural universe operates, but we have a clear violation right here, right now, that's different. That's a miracle.
Well, I think
I beg your pardon. When I look at the Bible and I evaluate whether I am reading something that could be divine, I don't see the God of the universe conveying to the ancient Hebrews that there are germs that cause disease. I don't see the God of the Bible conveying to them that there are ways to help ensure that they have water and to reduce the likelihood
the earth moves around the sun.
That they're going to have famine. Well, even practical things that could help them, right? Here's how to build a granary. Here's how to build a dam to ensure that you have water. Here is how to plant crops so that they will grow more effectively. We don't, even practical lessons like that, we don't see that. What we do see in the Bible, particularly when it comes to the profound moral questions, and I would argue that maybe even the author of Job was way ahead, I'm going to assume it was him, sorry ladies, was way ahead of his time in wrestling with the problem of evil. What I don't see is anything that uniquely would seem to indicate to me that the moral conclusions are significantly advanced that would persuade me or even indicate to me that there is something divine working behind the scenes in that person's authorship. What I see is the values and understanding of very much tied to that time and place.
Well, even better ethics, I don't think would be compelling evidence of God. I mean, we got to better ethics just from modernity,
right?
And,
just
and
from
enlightenment,
just from evolving,
and,
right?
and our own compassion and empathy. Yeah,
the better angels of our nature.
So, guys, just a question. I watched your fellowship video from October.
We've done a couple.
Yeah,
of
the five
one on
claims.
Zach's channels, the 5 claims.
Okay.
And you'd said something, I think, well, you both agree with it, so I'll just say you both say it.
Sure.
The idea of, and you briefly touched on it, fine-tuning the apparent orderliness in nature, the laws we've been talking about, gravity and gravitational constant and all that stuff. You compared that to what, I think it was you that said it.
Compared to the construction of the Bible.
The way the Bible is constructed.
Yeah.
So it seems like on the one hand the Bible was an organic mess, and the universe on the other hand seems very orderly.
If you're making that claim, certainly.
Yeah. So my question when I was at the video there, how would you? There's a couple of things there that I think maybe you could unpack. What do you mean by mess and order? How are you defining those things?
Well, so the point I was making in that talk was there are people who will, when defending creation, use this fine-tuning argument, right? Look at the intricacy of life and DNA. Look at the order and predictability and mathematical predictability of galaxies and orbits and all of the things that physics keeps revealing consistency. They'll use this as an argument for design, right? That the God of the universe is so ordered that the design shows from the micro to the macro and everything that science reveals. But then the very same people will defend this book where, for the most part, we don't know who wrote it. We don't know when it was written. We don't have any, corroborating evidence for any of the myth and magic. It wasn't even compiled until the 4th century. We don't have any of the originals. We have copies of copies of copies, right? And so, and it's inconsistent, between the Gospels, and obviously I focus more on the New Testament. But like that, this that just screams of a human process. It screams of something that is just like every other ancient book. It's a mess. I think I probably did use that word. Doesn't look at all like the order that you see in something like DNA. So the very people that are arguing for design in scientific terms don't call for and expect or find the same level of design in what's supposedly the most important revelation. Much more important than coding DNA.
So you're conceding the orderly arrangement of the universe.
I mean, I think that there are completely natural explanations for all of that.
But you are, I would just want to be clear, you're conceding the orderliness, are you? Or how do you define the order in making this argument?
I'm not using order as an argument for design. I don't see any design.
No. But comparing it to the mess, you're saying that
I think we find far more order in the universe, not evidence of design, but just patterns, predictable patterns, than we do in the construction.
So yeah, so you agree that there are orderly, predictable patterns.
Obviously, science finds those all the time.